The moment Ava stepped into the courthouse, she knew nothing would ever be the same again. Only 10 years old, but a void had followed her for as long as she could remember. Her mother, Rachel, always said she'd forgotten about her father, Mark, after he disappeared. But Ava knew in her heart, in that deep, unspoken place, that something was missing. And that day, Ava was determined to find what had been lost, determined to find him. The courtroom was just as bustling as always. Rachel sat at the front, tense but resolute. Her eyes were red and swollen from years of sleepless nights. As Ava sat beside her, she stole a glance at her mother. The fear, the uncertainty in her eyes. It made Ava's chest ache. She didn't quite understand it, but something inside her stirred. It was as if the love her mother had once held had faded. But Ava was sure, perhaps, just maybe, she could bring it back. Years ago, when Ava was still a baby, Rachel had left Mark. Since then, Rachel had spoken only of how he'd vanished, of how he became a stranger to them both. As Ava listened to the familiar story, she couldn't shake the feeling that something didn't add up. There was an emptiness she carried within her, an emptiness she believed could only be filled by finding the missing piece of her past. Today was the day she would change that. The trial began. The history between Rachel and Mark was laid bare, each word cutting deeper into the already scarred landscape of their past. As Rachel recounted how Mark had simply disappeared, Ava caught her mother's eyes for a fleeting moment. And in that moment, Ava knew. She had to search for the truth herself. She had to piece together her identity, her history, and her connection to her father. No longer could she accept her mother's version of the story. Ava's search for the missing pieces was just beginning. When Ava's turn to speak arrived, the room fell into a sudden silence. All eyes were on the young girl, and yet she stood with a maturity beyond her years. Even the defense attorney, poised and ready to speak, seemed to hesitate. Ava, too small for such a heavy responsibility, stood firm, her voice clear and strong. "My dad, Mark, he's not gone. He was here," Ava said, her voice a stark contrast to the uncertain atmosphere. "And I'm going to find him." For a split second, the entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath. Rachel's eyes welled up with tears, but she couldn't find the words. The stunned silence was palpable, but Ava's gaze never wavered. There was no mistaking her certainty. Mark had disappeared years ago, but Ava, with a heart full of hope and determination, was convinced that somewhere, in some way, he was still out there. Ava, with the purity and strength of a child, was going to bring him back. She was going to complete the story that had been left unfinished. The courtroom remained eerily quiet. Rachel looked at Ava, her heart breaking, but also filled with a strange sense of pride. The defense attorney reluctantly spoke up. "If her father isn't here, we can't proceed, can we?" Ava shook her head, her voice unwavering as she spoke. "He is here. I can feel it." As Judge Shaw prepared to announce his decision, Ava suddenly noticed the door creak open. And in that moment, the man she had never seen but always dreamed of, Mark, appeared at the doorway. Ava's heart raced, her eyes locked on him, knowing him, yet feeling like she didn't. Mark slowly walked towards her and kneeled down. They paused for a moment. Then Ava, without hesitation, ran into his arms. "I knew you'd come back," Ava whispered with a small smile. Mark took a deep breath. "It took me too long. I'm sorry." In that instant, Ava felt everything fall into place. Mark was her father, and maybe, just maybe, families could heal, even when it seemed like everything was lost.